Let me start with the question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. When Americans talk about regime change, when we talk about coups, sanctions, foreign interference, economic strangulation, why is it always framed as Republican obsession? Because if you actually look at the record, not the vibes, not the talking points, not the cable news character, you find something more inconvenient. You find bipartisan consensus. Tonight we're talking about Venezuela. We're talking about Nicolás Maduro. And we're talking about how Democrats from 2010 to 2025 didn't just tolerate efforts to remove him from power, they actively supported them. Presidents, senators, House leadership. This episode isn't about defending Maduro. It's not about romanticizing socialism. It's not about pretending Venezuela doesn't have serious problems. This episode is about truth, about how foreign policy actually works when the cameras are off, and about how Americans are routinely misled into thinking intervention only comes from one side of the aisle. When Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Washington saw an opening, not overnight, not drastically, but strategically. Nicolás Maduro didn't have Chavez's charisma. He didn't have his political instinct. And more importantly, he didn't have his insulation. Inside the Obama administration, Venezuela wasn't viewed as a partner. It was viewed as a liability. Human rights concerns were real, but they were also useful. By 2014, Democrats in Congress, led prominently by Senator Bob Menendez, pushed the Venezuelan Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act. That law didn't just condemn abuses, it authorized targeted sanctions against Venezuelan officials. This matters because sanctions are not symbolic. They are economic warfare by another name, and they were signed into law by President Barack Obama. In 2015, Obama issued an executive order declaring Venezuela an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. Listen to that again. Venezuela, a country with no capacity to invade the United States, declared a national security threat. That designation wasn't rhetorical. It was unlocked, sweeping sanctions authority. Democrats defended it loudly. Not one major Democratic leader called it imperialism. Not one called it overreach. They all called it necessary. This was the quiet normalization of regime pressure. The idea that economic collapse could be engineered and then blamed entirely on the target government. And politically it worked. By the end of Obama's term, Venezuela's economy was in free fall, and Washington already framed the story. From 2016 to 2018, Democratic leadership in Congress doubled down. Senators like Bob Menendez, Dick Durbin, Jeanne Shaheen, Chris Coons, they held hearings. They issued statements. They passed resolutions declaring Venezuela's elections illegitimate. This wasn't fringe politics. This was party leadership. House Democrats echoed the same line. Maduro is a dictator. His government had no legitimacy. The opposition must be supported. And then came 2019. January 2019 changed everything. Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president of Venezuela. Within days, the Trump administration recognized him. And so did Democratic leadership. Nancy Pelosi didn't hesitate. Chuck Schumer didn't hesitate. House Foreign Affairs Chairman Eliot Engel didn't hesitate. They all stood by Guaidó publicly and forcefully. Pelosi even called Maduro's government a regime of repression. Democratic lawmakers attended events with Venezuelan opposition figures. They released joint statements with Republicans. For a brief moment, Washington was united in something rare, open support for regime replacement. Now, were there dissenters? Yes. But were they few? Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, Rodrigo Ocasio-Cortez. They opposed military intervention. They criticized sanctions. But even they were careful to say that they did not support Maduro. That's important because the Overton window was already set. Opposing regime change didn't mean defending sovereignty. It meant simply objecting to how fast or forcefully it was happening. The core assumption that Maduro should go was rarely challenged. When Joe Biden became president in 2021, many expected a reset. What they got was continuity with polish. Sanctions stayed, pressure remained, rhetoric softened, but objectives didn't. Biden officials continued to call Maduro a dictator. The U.S. maintained recognition of the opposition. Oil sanctions were used as leverage. The message changed from remove him now to force him to comply. Same goal, different tempo. When Venezuela's 2024 election results were disputed, the Biden administration moved quickly. They recognized the opposition's claim to victory. They imposed new sanctions on Venezuelan officials. They coordinated with allies. Democrats in Congress applauded the move. By 2025, the position was unmistakable. Maduro's continued role was unacceptable. Here's the uncomfortable takeaway. If you were told Democrats oppose regime change, Democrats reject interventionism, Democrats are the anti-war party, Venezuela proves otherwise. What actually exists is a foreign policy consensus, one that survives elections, one that transcends rhetoric, one that believes U.S. power should shape outcomes abroad. The difference isn't whether to intervene, it's how loudly. This episode isn't about Venezuela alone. It's about honesty. Because if Americans don't understand how bipartisan foreign policy really is, they keep being shocked when the bombs fall, when the sanctions bite, and when the consequences arrive at our doorsteps. Let's get something straight right up front. This episode is not claiming the Republican Party is pro-socialist. It is not claiming the Republicans love Nicolás Maduro. And it's not pretending the Venezuelan regime is misunderstood. What this episode is doing is even far more uncomfortable. It's examining how Republican opposition to regime change, sanctions, and intervention, when taken to its logical extreme, has often resulted in practical functioning support for Maduro remaining in power. Not praise, not endorsement, but enablement. And in geopolitics, that distinction matters less than people even think. The clearest and most consistent Republican opposition to pressure on Maduro came from the libertarian wing of the party. Figures like Ron Paul and later Rand Paul argued that sanctions are collective punishment. Regime change violates national sovereignty. Venezuela failures are not America's responsibility. Ron Paul openly condemned U.S. efforts to isolate Maduro, warning that sanctions would only worsen civilian suffering and give the regime a scapegoat. Rand Paul echoed similar arguments in the Senate, frequently opposing sanctions on regimes as constitutional and humanitarian grounds. Now here's the key point. They were not wrong about sanctions hurting civilians. They're not wrong about U.S. hypocrisy, but they rarely answered the harder question. If all pressure is immoral, what replaces it? Because in the absence of pressure, Maduro stays. Libertarian purity doesn't remove dictators. It freezes reality in place. Next comes the America First faction. Less ideological, more transactional. This group wasn't interested in defending Maduro. They simply didn't see Venezuela as worth American attention. That view became increasingly common among populist conservatives, war-weary Republicans, Iraq foreign policy skeptics. For them, Venezuela wasn't a moral crisis, it was a distraction. Oil, minimal U.S. dependence. Military threat, none. Strategic payoff, questionable. This led to a dangerous reframing. Maduro wasn't the problem. Washington was. When intervention itself becomes the primary villain, authoritarian regimes benefit automatically. Now let's talk about Republican-aligned media and commentary. Several high-profile conservative commenters, while condemning socialism in theory, spent years downplaying Maduro's regime in practice. The framing usually followed a pattern. Yes, Maduro is bad, but sanctions are worse than socialism. The U.S. always lies about foreign enemies. This is another Iraq in doing this, Maduro was transformed from a tyrant into a background character, almost incidental. The focus shifted entirely to American wrongdoing. That shift matters, because when the spotlight moves off the dictator survives longer. While most Republicans supported pressure on Maduro, several notable figures consistently resisted it. Some opposed. Recognition of Juan Guaidó, Venezuelan opposition funding, sanction escalation. They argued Congress never authorized regime change. Executive power was being abused. Intervention creep was inevitable. These arguments came out of a mix of constitutional conservatives, anti-war Republicans, libertarian-leaning lawmakers, again, principled objections. But geopolitics doesn't reward principle. It rewards power, leverage, and cohesion. Every public fracture in the U.S.'s resolve weakens the pressure campaign. No discussion of Republicans in Venezuela is complete without the mention of Donald Trump. Trump's record is contradictory by design. On one hand, he recognized Juan Guaidó, imposed several oil sanctions, threatened military operations, and now has even conducted military operations. On the other hand, he openly questioned regime change wars, mocked nation building. He's entertained negotiations with adversaries. Inside Trump's coalition, this created confusion. Was Venezuela a moral crusade, a pressure tactic, a bargaining chip Trump himself facilitated? And that facilitation gave ammunition to Republicans who argued, if even the president isn't sure, why should we commit? One cannot argue the influence of Tucker Carlson and similar populist voices. Carlson repeatedly argued that the U.S. had no legitimate interest in Venezuela. Regime change has always benefited elites. Ordinary Americans gain nothing. Again, no praise for Maduro. By relentlessly attacking U.S. motives, the effect was the same. Maduro became less urgent, less evil, less relevant. In geopolitics, urgency is leverage. Take that away and time favors the incumbent regime. Senators like Mike Lee joined Rand Paul in raising war power concerns. Their position, no military threats without congressional authorization, no covert regime change, no executive adventurism. These were legitimate constitutional objections. But here's the consequence. By blocking credible threat, they reduced negotiating leverage. Maduro understood that the United States pressure was politically constrained. At times, Republican rhetoric began to mirror left-wing anti-imperialism. The language changed from Maduro is a tyrant to the U.S. is worse, the CIA caused this, sanctions are colonialism, and convergence is striking. Different ideologies, but ultimately the same result. The regime outlasts the outrage. Let's be precise. Most Republicans did not support Maduro ideologically. But support in geopolitics often looks like undermining pressure campaigns, treating authoritarianism as irrelevant, normalizing relations prematurely, fracturing international coalitions. You don't need to praise a dictator to help him survive. You just need to make his removal politically impossible. Here's the hard truth Americans rarely hear. Democrats built and normalized the regime change architecture. Republicans fractured it without replacing it, and the result, ultimately, sanctions without unity, pressure without resolve, condemnation without consequence, and Maduro stayed.